My name was Morgan Taylor. At 42, I had my own investment firm, an apartment overlooking Central Park, a diamond-studded watch, and a reserved table at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. I knew how to turn zeros on a screen into power, respect, and envy. And then it took just one signature, one wrong report, one phone call on the wrong night. 48 hours later, I was sitting in a gray jumpsuit, unable to remember how to breathe. The money was gone. The status was gone. All that remained was me and what I had done. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Morgan Taylor, and I was 42 years old when I stood at the peak of my world, heels clicking against the polished marble floors of a midtown Manhattan skyscraper. I wasn't just another executive in a sharp suit. I was the founder and CEO of Taylor Capital Strategies, a private financial advisory firm managing over $300 million in high-risk portfolios. My face had appeared on the covers of business magazines. My name had graced the speakers' lineup at Davos, and I had become the woman others whispered about in elevators. Ruthless, brilliant, dangerous. They weren't wrong. I came from nothing. I wasn't born into connections or Ivy League legacy. I grew up in Indianapolis, raised by a single mother who worked the night shift at a hospital and slept with a radio on to drown out the silence of exhaustion. I studied by the glow of a fridge light and paid my way through the University of Chicago with scholarships and bartending shifts. I learned early that ambition was a form of currency, and I spent mine wisely. After earning my MBA, I clawed my way up through firms that paid me less than male counterparts, but demanded more. I kept records of my accomplishments. I smiled at every backhanded compliment. I nodded through every meeting I wasn't invited to speak in. I watched men less competent rise faster, fall harder, and still land softer. I watched and waited. When the glass ceiling didn't crack, I drove a hairpin through it, figuratively and literally. That day, when I was passed over for a promotion in favor of a junior colleague with a famous last name, I walked into the ladies' room, pulled the pin from my bun, and jammed it into the drywall above the mirror. A reminder. The ceiling wasn't glass. It was arrogance and tradition disguised as transparency. I left that firm 3 weeks later and built my own. Taylor Capital Strategies started in a 2-room WeWork with a printer that jammed every 30 pages. I brought in my first client using nothing but LinkedIn messages and a bold cold call. I promised double-digit growth in under a year. I delivered in 10 months. Then came the referrals. Then came the attention. I didn't grow my business organically. I grew it aggressively, like an invasive species. By my second year, I was managing portfolios for celebrities, real estate dynasties, and tech startup founders who didn't know how to spell debt to equity. I understood money, not just the math of it, but the scent, the weight, the way it made people breathe differently. I understood fear in the eyes of a CEO 3 hours before a quarterly report. I understood the desperation in the voice of a man with $5 million in liquid assets, but no idea how to keep his children from bleeding him dry. I was the whisperer of numbers, the high priestess of risk. I made money move. My office overlooked Central Park, and the glass was tinted just enough to keep the sun out but the power in. Everything in that room had been selected with precision. Furniture in black and steel, no family photos, no clutter, only one piece of art, a framed quote in silver typeface that read, "Build something they can't ignore." My wardrobe was armor, Tailored suits in dark tones, silk blouses, subtle but brutal heels. I wore a watch that cost more than my first car, and every time I glanced at it, I was reminded of how far I had come from that cramped one-bedroom with the peeling linoleum. But success was never quiet. It came with noise, deadlines, press interviews, and anxiety that settled deep in the bones. I rarely slept more than 5 hours a night. My meals were protein bars and black coffee. I had a personal assistant who managed my time and a therapist I paid to ask me how I felt and not wait for an answer. I wasn't building a life. I was maintaining an empire built on velocity. The clients didn't see the panic. They saw projections and confidence. They saw a woman who walked into the room like she had written the market herself. I made money look easy. That was the trick. People pay more when they think you don't need it. That's why I never blinked at $1 million wire transfer and never said thank you. Gratitude is a form of submission, and I was never submissive. My closest relationships were transactional. I dated men who were useful, charming, and emotionally vacant, just like me. We exchanged compliments like securities, timed, strategic, and rarely sincere. My friends were other women like me, hard-edged, successful, a little lonely, and too proud to admit it. We drank overpriced wine at rooftop bars and laughed too loud to cover the silence underneath. No one asked if I was happy. That wasn't the goal. I was respected. I was feared. I was a brand. And yet, somewhere between earnings season and executive retreats, I stopped noticing the cost. Not the financial one. I always knew the bottom line, but the personal ledger. I hadn't spoken to my mother in years. My assistant knew more about my schedule than I did. I kept a spare toothbrush in the office because I sometimes slept on the couch after all-nighters. I told myself this was the price. Greatness always had a cost. I just never thought it would collect interest. I wasn't naive. I knew the line between legal and aggressive interpretation of regulations was thin and written in pencil. I had lawyers. I had disclaimers. I had a compliance officer who double-checked the numbers and called it risk management. I didn't falsify anything. I simply framed it. Everyone did it. I told myself that on repeat. Everyone did it. The market rewarded boldness, not caution. That's what I sold my clients. That's what I believed. Until the night I saw a name I didn't recognize on an internal report and ignored it. Until the morning I skimmed over an alert that didn't seem urgent. Until the moment I said, approve it, without reading the full memo. It was one decision, one shortcut. And that was how the empire began to crack, not with an earthquake, but with a whisper I didn't hear because I was too busy standing on top of the world. It began quietly, not with sirens or headlines, not with screaming markets or public disgrace. It started with silence, a silence I didn't recognize because my world had always been filled with noise. Notifications, footsteps, keyboard clicks, elevator chimes, the hum of fluorescent lights. But that morning, the silence had weight, a pause in the current, a glitch in the rhythm. I remember waking up at 4:47 a.m., long before my alarm. Something felt wrong, like a vibration beneath the surface that hadn't yet reached the skin. My bedroom was unusually cold. I checked the thermostat on the wall and saw a blinking error. I tried to call maintenance, but the line kept ringing. I dismissed it, wrapped myself in a silk robe, and made espresso like I always did. The machine hissed with the same arrogance as me, but the taste felt metallic, bitter in a way it never had before. By 6:30, my inbox was strangely still. No new updates from Tokyo, no overnight reports from London, No calendar adjustments from my assistant. I checked the Wi-Fi. It was working. I refreshed 3 times. Still nothing. I told myself it was an anomaly. Glitches happened. Systems needed resets. But the stillness was beginning to grow teeth. At 8 a.m., I walked into the office building and noticed the guard didn't greet me like he usually did. He just nodded, eyes down, like he didn't want to see mine. The elevator ride was slower than usual. I watched the red numbers tick upward, one by one, as if something was dragging them from the bottom. When I stepped into my office, the air felt wrong, thicker, stale, like it had been waiting for bad news to fill it. The first email that came through had the subject line, Urgent Legal Inquiry. I opened it, expecting a routine compliance check or a client concern. Instead, it contained a formal request from a government agency asking for records I hadn't thought about in months. Records connected to a fund that had long been dissolved, its assets redistributed, its statements filed away and forgotten. I stared at the screen for a full minute before realizing I hadn't blinked. I read the email again, then again. By noon, there were 5 more. One from the Securities and Exchange Commission, one from an investigative journalist I vaguely recognized, one from a former client asking pointed questions. The others were legal in nature, cold, precise, and heavy with implication. I began to sense the shape of something that hadn't yet formed completely, like watching the outline of a storm from the shore, not knowing if it would veer away or crash over you. I called my legal team. No answer. I called again. The third time, I left a message, trying to sound controlled. I heard my voice tremble for the first time in years. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, a temporary complication. But then I noticed something strange. Files were missing. Shared folders I accessed daily were locked. My cloud permissions had changed. My access was limited. I was being quietly pushed out of my own architecture. Around 3:00 p.m., the phone rang. Not my office line, my private line, the one only a few people knew. I answered instinctively. A man's voice, clipped and direct, identified himself as an investigator with the Department of Justice. He didn't ask questions. He gave instructions. He told me I would receive an official letter within hours. He told me not to alter or delete any financial records. He told me I had the right to retain counsel. Then he hung up. That was the moment I knew it was real. Not a scare, not a mistake, not a competitor's smear campaign. It was real, and it had already begun. I sat there for a long time, staring at the skyline. The buildings looked different, smaller, less solid, like cardboard cutouts on a stage I no longer belonged to. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to fight or freeze. I typed a message to my assistant, asking if she'd heard anything. The message never got delivered. The silence was no longer a glitch. It was a verdict. At 6:12 p.m., Bloomberg released the story. I didn't need to click the link. I saw my name in the headline, followed by the words, alleged misconduct, financial irregularities, and pending investigation. My photo appeared beside it, cropped from a speaking event at Columbia Business School, where I had lectured on ethical investment strategies. The irony was cruel. I watched the news cycle swallow me whole. Social media lit up. Anonymous accounts speculated. Industry blogs dissected my past deals. Former colleagues issued carefully worded statements. One of my oldest clients called and left a voicemail. His voice was filled with betrayal, like I had robbed him personally. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I didn't know how. By nightfall, the press camped outside my building. I closed the blinds. I turned off the lights. I unplugged everything that could ring, buzz, or blink. I sat in the dark with the city glowing outside my window, like a life I used to own and no longer recognized. I tried to think clearly. I opened financial records. I reviewed transactions. I traced the steps back, trying to find the moment when things went wrong. It was impossible to isolate. There had been too many compromises, too many temporary adjustments, too many moments when I told myself, just this once. It hadn't been a single decision. It had been erosion, slow and constant, a shaving away of integrity until the core was hollow. At 11:37 p.m., I received a text from an unknown number. It read, "They're coming tomorrow. Be ready." I stared at the screen until it dimmed and disappeared. There was nothing left to do. I lay on the cold floor of my penthouse, still dressed in the suit I had worn to the office that morning. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I didn't sleep. That night had no light, no sound, no future. It was the pause between two lives, and I knew when the sun rose, it would not be for me. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the sharp bleach of office buildings or the dry-cleaned scent of conference rooms. It was heavier, a mix of rusted metal, old sweat, and something sour that clung to the walls like a warning. I stood still for a moment, holding the plastic bin that contained everything I was now allowed to own. One bar of soap, a scratchy towel, two sets of clothes, and a pair of shoes that didn't fit. I was processed like a parcel, stripped, scanned, photographed, fingerprinted, questioned. They asked for names of relatives, emergency contacts, medical conditions, allergies, past trauma. I answered mechanically. My voice no longer sounded like mine. It came out low, tired, disconnected from the woman I used to be. The guards barely looked at me. To them, I wasn't the subject of a news scandal or the CEO of a collapsed empire. I was just another intake, another file, another body. They led me down a hallway that stretched on forever. The floor was painted gray, with chips revealing older layers beneath. The lights above flickered inconsistently, casting long shadows that made it hard to gauge distance. The sound of footsteps echoed off the walls, and I realized I had started counting them. A reflex, something to keep time when clocks were forbidden. When we stopped, a key turned in a lock. A gate slid open with a shriek. I stepped inside. Cell 47B. It was smaller than I expected, just wide enough for two narrow beds with thin mattresses, a metal toilet bolted to the wall, and a stainless steel sink stained with age. The walls were painted off-white, though most of the paint had peeled or yellowed. The window was just a slot, high above, with bars that blocked even the smallest view. No skyline, no light, just a diffused glow that told me when it was day and when it wasn't. There was a woman already inside. She didn't speak. She sat on the lower bunk, back against the wall, arms crossed. She glanced at me once and returned to her silence. I didn't know her name. I didn't ask. The rules of this place were unspoken, but instinctual. You didn't talk unless you were spoken to. You didn't ask why someone was there. You didn't reach for connection until it was offered, and even then, you questioned it. I took the top bunk. Climbing onto it was awkward in shoes that pinched my toes, with a mattress that sagged in the middle and springs that groaned under my weight. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. It was stained in spots, damp rings, pencil graffiti, scrapes that looked like fingernails. The air was still. I tried to breathe through my mouth to avoid the scent. It didn't help. The first night was the worst. not because anything happened, but because nothing did. I had never experienced such uninterrupted emptiness. No emails, no calls, no alarms, no sound of traffic or distant sirens, just the occasional cough or the clang of gates in the distance. My body ached from tension I hadn't realized I was carrying, every muscle clenched, waiting for something. Violence, shame, a voice, anything. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just lay there, motionless, as hours passed like molasses. I listened to my cellmate's breathing and tried to match mine to hers, hoping to feel less alone. It didn't work. Morning started with lights that snapped on like gunshots. A loudspeaker barked orders I couldn't fully understand. We had 5 minutes to line up outside our cells. I fumbled with the uniform, which hung loose on my shoulders and bunched at the sleeves. My reflection in the metal sink startled me. My face looked gray. My eyes were swollen. My hair was pulled back tight, but strands had escaped and curled around my face like someone else's memory. The food was bland and dense. Plastic trays, mystery textures. No one talked at breakfast, just the clatter of trays and the occasional grunt. I sat alone and ate only what I had to. The days blurred quickly. Chores, counts, lineups, inspections. I was assigned to laundry duty. I folded uniforms that smelled like bleach and steam, my fingers cracking from the heat and chemicals. I worked beside women who barely acknowledged me. I kept my head down and followed instructions. No one cared who I had been. In here, I was a number on a chart. My past didn't matter. My name didn't carry weight. There were no speeches, no conferences, just sweat, silence, and survival. I learned to move with the rhythm of the place, step out when they call, stop when they signal, return when they order. Every movement was choreographed by whistles, buzzers, and habit. I lost track of the days almost immediately. There were no calendars, and nothing marked the time except meals and head counts. I marked them on the inside of my mind, scratching them onto an invisible wall just to stay sane. Sleep came in fragments, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, always shallow. I began dreaming of elevators that never stopped and floors that never opened. I dreamed of my office building, abandoned and rotting, overgrown with vines. I dreamed of voices whispering numbers that made no sense. I always woke up sweating. One afternoon during inspection, a guard pulled my mattress apart and found a paperclip I didn't know was there. She yelled. I froze. I didn't speak. I was sent to solitary for 24 hours. The cell was even smaller, with no bunk, just a slab and a bucket, no window, just walls that closed in like lungs exhaling forever. I counted each breath, afraid I'd forget how to come back to myself. When I returned to cell 47B, my cellmate had rearranged our space. She had taken my soap and swapped it for hers. I didn't complain. I simply sat on my bunk and stared at my shoes, now lined neatly by the door. They still didn't fit. Weeks passed, or months. I wasn't sure. I received 2 letters, one from a legal aid representative and one from a journalist requesting a statement. I ignored both. What could I say? That I didn't know? That I hadn't meant to? That I thought I was above this? No one would believe me, and part of me didn't believe it either. The prison library became my only refuge. I signed up for time every week. There was something about the order of the books, the silence of the pages, the feel of words that hadn't judged me yet. I began rereading old finance textbooks, not because I missed the life, but because they were the only language I still remembered fluently. In the margins, I wrote notes, not about money, but about how to survive, about what it meant to be nothing, about how to rebuild when your foundation had rotted. I didn't know who I was writing for, maybe just for the woman I used to be, the one who thought she could never fall. Cell 47B didn't ask for permission to become home. It just did. One day, I sat on the lower bunk and realized I no longer looked for the exit. I no longer waited for the gate to swing open. I simply endured. I wasn't Morgan Taylor, CEO. I wasn't the woman on magazine covers. I was inmate year 61734, assigned to laundry, living in a concrete box with a woman who hadn't spoken my name. And yet, somehow, I was still breathing, still counting, still here. It started with a whisper behind me in the laundry line. A woman muttered something about getting out and not going back in. I wasn't part of the conversation, but I heard every word. She said she had no idea how to open a bank account. Another said her cousin had ruined her credit by using her social security number. Someone else mentioned payday loans, $20 fees, and a bounced check that landed her back inside. Their voices were tired, full of resignation, not fear, just the dull ache of knowing that freedom, when it came, would be fragile and full of traps. They weren't afraid of being locked up. They were afraid of failing again, of being broke and invisible and overwhelmed. I knew that fear too well now. I had once lived above it, convinced it was for other people. But in that moment, I saw it for what it was, a cycle, designed, engineered, a loop with no exit signs. I didn't say anything that day. I folded the uniforms, ran the press, rinsed the bins, and returned to my cell. But the words stayed with me. They clung to me through the night, sharp and urgent like glass in my sheets. I tried to forget them. I told myself it wasn't my job anymore. That part of me, the part that knew money like muscle memory, was gone. But it wasn't. I had spent a lifetime mastering a language most people never learned. And now I was surrounded by women who had never been taught how to say the simplest words in it. Not because they were stupid, because no one had ever shown them how. So I did something I hadn't done in months. I asked for paper. There was a sign-up sheet at the library for supplies, legal pads, pencils, highlighters, whatever the prison could spare. I wrote my name and waited 2 weeks. When I finally received a small spiral-bound notebook and a dull pencil, I held them like they were sacred, not because they were valuable, but because they were permission to become useful again. I sat at the far table in the back of the library, where no one ever went. The light was dim, the chair wobbled, and the air smelled faintly of glue and old pages. I opened the notebook and wrote the word money in block letters at the top. Then I sat still for a long time, pencil resting against the paper. I didn't know where to begin, not with hedge funds or portfolios or tax shelters. I had to go further back to what no one had taught me either, but what I'd figured out along the way. So I wrote, "What is a dollar?" Underneath, I answered, "A promise." From there, it grew slowly. I wrote about checking accounts, savings accounts, compound interest, overdraft fees. I explained what credit scores were, how they were built, and how they were destroyed. I drew diagrams of how money flowed through systems, how banks moved it, how lenders made it cost more, how debt could grow like mold. I didn't use big words. I stripped the jargon down to its bones. No acronyms, no corporate gloss, just truth. At first, it was just for me, a ritual, a way to mark time. But one afternoon, a woman named Carla saw the notebook on my bunk while I was brushing my teeth. When I returned, She was flipping through it with a furrowed brow. She asked what it was. I told her. She asked if she could read more. I said yes. The next day, she came back with a question about budgeting. She wanted to know how to track what little money she got from commissary and her brother's occasional transfers. I showed her a simple way to log income and expenses in columns. She told her friend. Her friend told two more. Within a week, 5 women were asking me questions after dinner, scribbling numbers on napkins, trying to understand why their accounts always ended up empty. So I started holding informal sessions in the library. No announcements, no signs, just a group of women sitting around a table while I explained how credit card interest worked or how to read a paycheck stub. We weren't supposed to gather like that. Technically, it wasn't against the rules, but it drew attention. One of the guards asked what we were doing. I said we were studying. He laughed and walked away. I kept teaching. Every lesson came from the notebook. I added more pages, loans, rent agreements, medical bills. I showed them how to write down questions before calling a bank, how to ask about fees, how to say no. Some of them were skeptical. They thought it was pointless. They said life out there didn't care what you knew. But even those women stayed. Even they listened. It wasn't about becoming rich. It was about having a chance, about knowing the difference between a scam and a contract, about not signing something just because a man in a tie said it was fine. One night, a woman named Denise pulled me aside after class. She had never spoken during the sessions, always quiet, always at the edge of the group. She told me she had 3 kids, that she'd signed her paycheck over to a boyfriend for years because he said it was easier that way. She asked me how to get a copy of her own bank statements. I showed her. She cried. I didn't cry. I couldn't. But something shifted inside me, a new kind of weight. Not shame, not fear, purpose. I began to see the notebook not as a tool, but as a life raft. Each sentence, each diagram, each page was a rope being thrown back across a chasm I had once flown over and never looked down at. These women had never been taught how to survive in the financial world. They had been punished for not knowing, then punished again for failing. And no one had ever stopped to say, "It's not your fault." So I said it every chance I got. They began adding to the notebook stories, mistakes, tips. One woman explained how she avoided ATM fees by going to the grocery store. Another wrote down what to say to collections agencies. We turned it into a kind of shared ledger, not just of numbers, but of experience. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And in a place where everything was designed to reduce you to a statistic, creating something, anything, felt like rebellion. I didn't feel like a fraud anymore. I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a bridge. And that notebook, battered and smudged and filled with crooked lines and erased mistakes, was the first thing I had built in years that didn't collapse. I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't care, because for the first time since I'd lost everything, I was giving something back. It was raining when they told me I was getting out. The counselor didn't look at me when she handed over the paper. Early release for good behavior. She spoke with the same tone she probably used to read parking fines. Flat, uninterested, procedural. I stared at the date printed at the top, and something inside me felt both heavier and hollow. I folded the paper carefully, as if it might tear under the pressure of the moment, and slipped it into the waistband of my uniform. I didn't thank her. I just nodded and walked back to my cell in silence. There was no countdown, no farewell ceremony, just the slow unzipping of a chapter that had no clean ending. I had spent so long inside that the idea of leaving felt abstract, like someone else's good fortune. I didn't know what waited for me outside the fences, but I knew it wouldn't be a return. There was nothing to return to. My cellmate said nothing. She glanced at me, then went back to folding her blanket. I didn't expect words. There was no room for sentimentality where we lived, just acknowledgments, glances, maybe a gesture. When I began packing my few things, my toothbrush, my prison ID, the small spiral-bound notebook now filled with pages of numbers and stories, she moved aside without speaking. I carried it in a clear plastic bag. Everything I owned now fit into it. The bag fogged with my breath as I held it against my chest. I tried not to think of the woman I'd been when I first arrived. She felt like a rumor. They walked me out through the back door, not the front, not the one where families stood with balloons and car engines running. This exit was narrow, cement-walled, wet from the rain that had blown in through a broken pane near the ceiling. The guard behind me didn't speak, just motioned forward. There was no one waiting, no car, no driver, no friends, no distant relative pretending to care. They handed me a bus voucher and an envelope with $25. The state's way of saying, good luck, a formality masquerading as mercy. I held the envelope like a brittle relic and stepped into the gray morning. Outside, the world had changed in invisible ways. Cars looked sleeker. Advertisements used slogans I didn't recognize. People walked fast, staring at devices thinner than any I had owned. The air smelled different, more exhaust, more plastic, less warmth. I felt like a foreigner in a country that spoke my language, but no longer knew my name. I found the bus stop and sat on a metal bench slick with rain. A pigeon walked near my foot, then darted away when the bus hissed into view. I climbed the steps and handed over the voucher without meeting the driver's eyes. The bus smelled like old vinyl and forgotten groceries. I took a seat near the back and pressed my forehead against the window. It was foggy with condensation, and I wiped it with my sleeve like a child. We passed neighborhoods I didn't recognize, grocery stores, discount pharmacies, payday loan offices, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I remembered helping clients invest in chains like these, explaining to them how poverty could be monetized, how predictable consumer behavior could be when people were desperate. I remembered using words like risk profile and urban volatility to describe lives I'd never touched. Now I was part of the footnote. The bus dropped me off downtown, near a shelter. I stood there for a long time, unsure whether to go in. I had no apartment, no suitcase, no plan. My bank accounts had been closed. My name had been erased from directories and mailing lists. The only thing I still owned was knowledge, and even that felt frayed at the edges. I didn't want to stay in the shelter, but I had nowhere else to go. The woman at the intake desk asked a few questions and handed me a cot number and a locker key. I nodded, said as little as possible, and found my way through the echoing hall lined with folding beds and hollow eyes. The room was filled with the sounds of coughing, muttering, and the occasional plastic rustling of food wrappers. I placed my bag under the cot and sat down. That night, I lay awake listening to the sound of a woman snoring 2 beds over and another crying softly into her pillow. I clutched the notebook to my chest, afraid it might be taken. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I visited the public library. It was one of the few places that still felt neutral, quiet, warm, and free. I used one of the shared computers and created a new email address. I didn't sign into my old accounts. I let them die. Instead, I drafted a proposal. It was simple, a community workshop series on financial literacy for formerly incarcerated women, free of charge. Topics covered: budgeting, bank accounts, credit repair, avoiding predatory lending. I wrote it in plain English, without corporate jargon. I attached a scanned copy of the notebook pages I'd recopied by hand. I sent it to 3 nonprofit organizations and 1 church. I didn't expect an answer, but 2 days later I received a reply. A community outreach coordinator named Leah said she was intrigued. She invited me to meet her the following week. I borrowed clothes from the shelter's donation closet, a pair of black pants that were too short and a blouse that smelled faintly of perfume and dust. I pressed them with my hands, tied my hair back with a rubber band, and walked 20 blocks to the community center. My shoes rubbed blisters into my heels. The building was small and modest. The lobby smelled like coffee and floor wax. Leah greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that didn't flinch when she saw my record. She asked me questions, not about what I had done, but about what I wanted to do. I told her the truth. She gave me a chance. I started teaching on Monday mornings in a windowless room with a whiteboard and a dozen metal chairs. The women came slowly at first, cautious, skeptical. Some only stayed 10 minutes. Others lingered. I used the same notebook, expanded now, revised with clearer diagrams and real-world examples. I didn't preach. I just explained how to open a checking account without getting trapped by overdraft fees, how to read a lease agreement, how to build credit with nothing but a prepaid card and consistency, how to ask questions, how to say no. They asked questions, hard ones, personal ones. They told me stories. One had co-signed a car loan and lost everything. Another had spent 6 months being paid under the table because she didn't have ID. I listened. I didn't judge. I remembered their faces. And slowly the room filled. Some brought friends. Some brought their children. Some brought notebooks of their own. I still lived at the shelter. I still washed my clothes in a plastic basin and dried them near a window. I still had blisters on my feet and a record that kept doors closed. But something had opened. I wasn't chasing redemption. I wasn't trying to undo what I had done. I was building something else, quietly, patiently, without fanfare or applause, a different kind of empire, not built on risk, but on repair, not on power, but on knowledge, not on names, but on faces. And this time, I wasn't walking through the front door. I was building my own. There was a day when people used to say my name with weight. In conference calls, in meetings, in articles, it carried an edge, like a sharp corner on glass. Morgan Taylor. It sounded expensive. It sounded precise. It was a name people repeated to feel closer to power, a name that opened doors and held boardrooms in silence. Now it was just a sound. No title, no signature line, no curated biography. Just Morgan. The woman sitting at the bus stop with a coffee in a recycled cup and an envelope of lesson plans held together with a binder clip. I didn't miss the old life. I missed the illusion of control it gave me. The rhythm, the pacing, the certainty that came from calendars booked 2 months in advance and assistants reminding me of who I was supposed to be. That Morgan had been constructed like a machine, a series of habits, poses, outfits, and calculated silences. I remembered her, but I no longer lived inside her. Now, my days began with silence. Not the charged silence of a penthouse before a meeting, but a softer, uncurated kind. The kind that came from waking before sunrise in a halfway house where the heater clanked through the night and someone always snored too close. I would make instant oatmeal with hot water from a dented kettle and sit by the window while the sky changed slowly from gray to blue. I taught 3 classes a week, sometimes more when they could find the funding. Community centers, shelters, reentry programs. They didn't always have projectors or working whiteboards. Sometimes I brought my own markers. Sometimes I used printouts from the public library. I didn't wear suits. I didn't speak in bullet points. I spoke in stories. I told them how credit cards work, what fees to watch for, how to spot scams. I showed them how to budget on a paycheck that vanished before the second week. I explained the fine print. I taught them how to ask questions no one had ever let them ask. Some days the room was full. Some days it was nearly empty. But I showed up anyway, because I remembered what it felt like not to know and to be punished for it. I remembered the cold silence of being judged without context, of being handed forms no one explained, of being told you should have known better when no one had ever taught you anything at all. They didn't care who I had been. They didn't ask about my past. Some knew, some looked me up. The articles were still online, but in those rooms I was not disgraced executive or former Wall Street star. I was the woman who explained how to read your pay stub and why payday lenders should be avoided. Sometimes, after class, women lingered to talk. Not about money, but about fear, about starting over, about the weight of names they no longer wanted and choices they couldn't undo. I listened. I offered what I could. Sometimes that was advice, sometimes just silence. We all carried something we couldn't quite explain. Prison had taught us that language often failed where experience didn't. I found ways to stretch my limited money. I shopped at thrift stores and memorized which groceries were cheapest at which places. I learned how to apply for grants and wrote proposals on the same library computer where I had first sent my name into the void. I created a digital version of my notebook and printed it in small batches when I could afford it. I gave them away at every session. Some women cried when they received it, said no one had ever given them something that felt theirs. At night, I walked, not for exercise, but for grounding. I liked the sound of my shoes on sidewalks, the rhythm of motion without destination. I passed places that reminded me of my old life: tall buildings, glossy lobbies, people with Bluetooth headsets talking to numbers. I didn't envy them. I watched them the way you watch a film you've already seen, with distance, with memory, but without desire. I no longer chased recognition. There were no interviews, no cameras, no handshakes from executives pretending to be allies. What I did now didn't make headlines, but it mattered. One woman sent me a letter from her new job saying she finally opened a savings account. Another said she taught her daughter how to balance a budget using our workbook. These stories weren't dramatic. They weren't loud, but they were real. I found an apartment eventually, a small studio above a laundromat with a window that let in just enough light to read by in the mornings. I painted the walls myself with a roller that left uneven streaks I never bothered to fix. I kept plants on the windowsill. They didn't always thrive, but they didn't die either. I considered that a victory. My name didn't ring anymore. It didn't echo. But I learned to live in the quiet, to appreciate the weight of anonymity, to find meaning not in scale, but in substance. One afternoon, a woman I had never met walked up to me outside the community center. She looked nervous, said her friend had taken my class and taught her how to open her first bank account. She asked if I had more of those notebooks. I reached into my bag and handed her one. She smiled and said, "Thank you." Not like a student, not like a fan, just one woman to another. I watched her walk away, notebook pressed to her chest like something sacred, and I felt something inside me settle, not pride, not triumph, just peace. I wasn't rebuilding my reputation. I wasn't reclaiming a throne. I was planting seeds in places no one else looked, and that was enough. That was all it ever needed to be.